So we'll now move on to the first of our afternoon agenda items, our panel discussion incorporating perspectives on development assistance. We're going to explore together how we might do development better. Some of the key questions we intend to look at include: how can we best empower the communities we work with? How can we best ensure that development programming is designed explicitly by the communities and people it supports? The international community has been talking a lot about localization for some time now. So what more can be done to ensure that people and communities are drivers of change, setting their own agenda and reflecting their own local development priorities? What have we been doing well? What has to change? And why hasn't this happened? And then, does the link between money and power mean that donor countries inevitably set and control the development agenda? And does this mean that international NGOs are fighting a losing battle if they want to change where the power lies? So these are some of the big questions that we want to be looking at. So I'd like to move on to introduce each of our guest panelists. We have with us today Karimi Kinoti, who is Head of Africa Division at Christian Aid. Very well welcome, Karimi. We have Tatu Gatere, the co-founder and CEO of Buildher. Welcome, Tatu. And we have Anusha Bharadwaj, the Executive Director of Voice for Girls. So we're going to hear from each of them in turn, from Karimi, from Tatu, and from Anusha. They're going to give us their thoughts on some of these questions that we're asking for around about 5 minutes. I'll let them all speak, and then there'll be time for questions for discussion. If questions are occurring to you as we have each of our speakers, please do put them in the chat box or use the raised hand function. Okay, so we'll start off with Karimi. Karimi is, as I said, Head of Africa Division at Christian Aid. She's very passionate about Africa's social and economic transformation, and she brings vast experience to tackling the challenges of poverty in Africa. She's been pivotal in promoting sustainable development models through innovative approaches to agriculture and food systems, climate change, and affordable healthcare. She's worked in the NGO sector for more than 15 years and currently heads up the Africa Division at Christian Aid. Prior to joining Christian Aid, she was founding director of Fiklaha, a faith-based peacebuilding organisation. She serves on several boards, including as chair of Nayuki Hubs Limited, a social enterprise serving thousands of beekeepers in Kenya. So Karimi, we're really interested to hear what you have to tell us, some of your insights from all your experience and all your work. Please go ahead. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Geraldine, and thank you for the invitation to share some of my perspectives around development assistance, and particularly in relation to shifting the power. And I think the starting point is that we have had an international development model for 70 years, I would say, coming out of the Second World War in 1945. And over the time, especially since the structural adjustment programs were introduced by the World Bank and the IMF in the 1980s, we have seen this structure of international aid system and development system really grow quite big, both as becoming quite bureaucratized, a huge conglomerate of several actors, including international NGOs, donors, that some of whom have been mentioned, local NGOs, management consultancies, accounting firms, monitoring and evaluation, research and evidence communities, all looking at how effective should development, can development be value for money, etc. So it's quite a complex, multi-billion-dollar industry. And I think that the question we're asking here is what happens next, in the 21st century going forward. And we know that a lot of it has been quite driven, donor-driven, driven by money, unfortunately, even though money is important as resources. So that's on the one hand. And the other one has been, pictures and narratives around sympathy and compassion. But I'd like to suggest that for us to really look at what happens going forward, then we need to understand that in many ways this is a broken system, and some of the relationships that probably are not around co-creation, around voice and agency of local communities. And I know that at the moment there is quite some work around what does localization mean, how do we get a voice and agency of the communities that we're all concerned about, in ways that really give them the power and the agency to determine their destiny going forward, and how does everybody else, or parts of the system, as I've said, share in enabling a different and a shift of power, if you like. And I think I would recommend definitely the Bond development, so Bond, the UK Bond Networks report that came out in July this year, that talks about the 4 transitions around climate, around new routes to development, redistribution, reinvention of charity. And I was particularly struck by the comments that's made that we as international NGOs need to rethink our role and purpose, and that there are global shifts that present new opportunities for other actors to step up and achieve development outcomes. And even though this has been an ongoing discussion over many years, we kind of go into cycles about what makes for good development. I definitely feel that when we look across, even outside of the NGO development sector, some of the innovations that are coming up, and I would mention one that happened all the way in 1998 with a Sudanese telecoms engineer, Mo Ibrahim, introducing the mobile network at a point that nobody, he got very few investors to the project, around really opening Africa to wireless telephony, communications, and then of course Vodafone and Safaricom built on that with mobile platforms for money, for the unbanked, financial inclusion. And now we are seeing other innovations coming through with agriculture, with health, and humbly, I would say that has done more in the case of Africa than probably the thousands of short-term projects that we've seen. Now, to the localization agenda, which really is about agency, about people in communities being drivers of their own development priorities and setting their own agenda. I think that is a fantastic framing. I think it moves out of some of the framing that has been part of the narrative over 70 years, I'd say, of lack, of helplessness, of hopelessness, of people needing to be saved. which is really problematic. Even from the perspective of the Africa Union, with what is known as Africa 2033, the Africa 63, sorry, the Africa we want to see, there's very clearly that the future needs to be driven by Africa's citizens. There's need for a high standard of living, quality of life and well-being, healthy and well-nourished citizens. And there's no reason why a continent like ours should need to import any of its food. We have a third of our food that the continent needs to import. 38% of children are stunted because they don't have enough nutrients. 50% of our fruits and vegetables that are produced goes to waste. And yet we know right from the communities where we have those whom we call vulnerable and marginalized, they have the productive assets, all the way from the traditional green vegetables, the nutritious legumes, some of which grow in climate harsh conditions. We have our young people who make up, as you may know, more than 60% of the overall population, who have ideas, bright ideas, and technology opportunities to back that up. And so to give some of the an example of what it actually means to move beyond probably having an agenda set from outside and finding communities to be part of that project. We have been involved in quite what I find an exciting project. Yes, it's a project, but it's one that takes the objective of not short-term great report to donors, but actually looks at how do we work with communities on the ground and support with technology, support with skills, look at what the farmers on the ground have. And this is an example I would give from Zambia with Scottish Government funding, where we have, in collaboration with Strathclyde University, actually supported 4,200 farmers to produce horticulture produce using solar-powered irrigation technology. And we know with climate change, with rain-fed agriculture, that becomes a challenge. And be able to actually also train 500 young people in agribusiness management at a place where we need, or our different countries need extension services for farmers. So really, bringing together a multi-sectoral initiative that at the end of that program will be a social enterprise that is owned by the community and that they can continue to produce, to find markets, and to find consumers who also require the produce. So to conclude, I would say that for us, it's really embracing. I feel that going forward, embracing social innovation that looks at the productive assets that our communities have on the ground, that really creates economic self-autonomy, which means incomes beyond subsistence living, freedom to educate children, to access affordable healthcare, and so on. And importantly, also jobs that are created for our young people, for our women, and other members of community. And finally, what it begs of us, and probably in the discussion we can have have this conversation on new forms of international solidarity. Who do those of us who are international actors speak for, on what, and why? Let me stop there.
Thank you, Karimi. I should have mentioned at the start that unfortunately Stella Gama, who is the forestry advisor for the government of Malawi, can't be with us today. She was originally on the programme, but she had to send her apologies, unfortunately. So thanks, Karimi. Thank you for that wealth of experience and some of those really practical examples that you brought in there. I'm going to move on to Tatu. Tatu, I'm going to invite you to speak. Tatu is an entrepreneur, an architect, and a built environment enthusiast. She has over 13 years' experience in the built environment sector and has focused her career on exploring the intersection of culture and the built environment in a variety of socioeconomic and cultural contexts to facilitate physical, social, and economic development. She's the co-founder and CEO of Buildher, a Kenyan-based organisation which works to equip women with accredited construction skills, leading to greater financial prosperity, changing male attitudes, and promoting gender equality within the construction industry. So we're really looking forward to what you have to tell us, Tatu. This just sounds like amazing work. Please go ahead. If you could try to keep to 5 minutes so that we've got time for discussion, that would be brilliant. Thanks, Tatu.
Thank you so much. And I will try to keep to the 5 minutes. Just to give a caveat first, that my background is an architect who went into development. So built environment is my focus and what challenged me most. So when I looked at this question of localization, I mean, I agree with Karimi that first of all, agency, bringing agency back to actors within the continent has been very helpful. And it's been very positive towards inclusive, holistic, and sustainable development. But I also think it would be helpful to support funds going to new emerging areas that may not seem as popular, or I will use even the term sexy because it's something that comes up often in what's the trend and what's new and what's hot and where should the money go. And I think in development, we see that as well. We see funds going into areas that have holistically been areas of challenge. But if we look at urban development and the crises that's developing from those sectors, there are new emerging problems that funds are not being channeled to, and conversation and visibility is not given to those areas. So I think it would be helpful to address those critical challenges that may not seem pertinent at a global scale, but are actually very critical at a local level. For instance, our work at Buildher revolves around women's empowerment on one level, which again is high visibility in that area, but also involves construction education, employment access, as well as advocacy and safeguarding of women as we disrupt a male-dominated sector. So some of those areas are not global agenda priorities, but on a local scale, we know that population growth, unemployment, effects of urbanization, and the increasing demand for safe construction, as well as affordable housing, are critical issues that need to be addressed. So to give an example, I think it was 2005 when the National Construction Authority of Kenya released a report that almost half the buildings in the city of Nairobi were not safe. And so as much as we're talking about health access and agriculture and other issues which are also important, you know, there's more than 1.3 billion people on the continent, and urban development is a critical issue. And if we don't have safe buildings, which nobody's talking about, this will be a major challenge in a few years. So I feel that disruptive approaches, they have the potential to tackle multiple levels of change, progress, development, but can often be harder to sustain. So on a global scale, an issue might not seem that important, as I've mentioned, but you can see a lot of issues coming up that deal with approaches that may be far-reaching and have greater potential to catalyze sustainable change. So I'll just mention a few initiatives that have impacted how we do our work at Buildher. There's a movement in the matatu industry, that's the public transportation industry, that began a few years ago, that looked at safety and security of women in public transportation. And this wasn't an area that received high visibility, but it opened a whole conversation on women's access to male-dominated sectors. What do they need? What does things like sexual harassment look like when taught from a local scale in a community that's very patriarchal. How do you deal with those issues of development? And how do you structure training and knowledge, respect and value in those areas? And for us, we're looking at these small invisible movements that people have had, which can help us navigate a huge problem, which is women's empowerment. But we need to address it from the context of our local beliefs in order to see change. So I feel like if a local effort meets an international development priority in a small way, but has an additional value to local context challenges, it would be helpful to structure partnership evaluations to include that multi-level analysis. And then the last thing I will say is, I do think donor countries do set and control the development agenda, but I, however, don't think it's a losing battle if donor countries remain flexible to test, learn, iterate, to fail, and to work to succeed in partnership with local NGOs. And if local NGOs continue to have the courage to push back and to communicate on aspects of support that don't make sense at a local level. Again, I'll give an example at Buildher. We've really focused on depth of impact rather than numbers and rapid scale, because this can't work for a technical training program that needs to create safety in an established trade. So we need more time with the women, more training, and then we also have a whole advocacy piece to ensure women are safe. So in focusing on depth of impact, we may have had to rule out support from a number of global agenda priorities or organizations, but we choose to do this because we know at a local level it makes sense. So without flexibility and an interest in without flexibility and an interest in international NGOs, these kind of conversations are not possible. And there may be a number of high potential, high impact initiatives that won't survive if we don't have that level of scrutiny and that openness of conversation and the structure to engage new initiatives. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tatu. Thank you so much for being so succinct so that we've got some time for questions at the end, but that's really interesting stuff. Thank you. We're moving on quickly to Anusha then. Anusha leads a very passionate group of girls at Voice for Girls, a social enterprise that educates and empowers marginalised adolescent girls with the vision to eliminate gender inequality and violence. She's also the founding director of, I don't know how to pronounce it, SOCHA for Social Change, but Anusha, you can tell us about it. A platform that offers young women a chance to become future ready and to develop their leadership capacities and enable them to become agents of change. So I'm going to pass over to you, Anusha. And again, if you could try and keep to the 5 minutes and we'll have some time for some chat and discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Geraldine, for that introduction. And I think to just take forward that introduction, I work with adolescent girls and women. I mean, I'm super passionate about working with them because I believe that you give them a little bit, they can just exponentially grow from there, and that's really addictive to me. So to take it forward from here, I'd like to say that focusing on Voice for Girls and the work we work with adolescent girls, like I said, and it's a very unique community group. So these girls have so much potential, but are as much vulnerable to dropping out of any mainstream system. So this community can easily fall through the cracks, and she can just disappear, have children, and she'll never surface till much later. So having worked with the 84,000 adolescents, we know that she has the power to change, but she's running really backwards on an escalator that's moving up. So so then as a person representing the organization with donor agencies, one of the most tricky things is to really push the agenda as quickly as possible, because I know, come summer, she's going to go home, she's going to, have her first period, and that's it. We're never going to see her again. So, so how do we have, with a few community groups that are really, time sensitive in the sense that if you don't do programming with them, they can disappear. How do we have funders who, even though with best intentions, are really far away from the community and their realities? And so they're going to look at data, and they're going to look at reports, and they're going to look at something very cold to make decisions to fund. So So how do we really look at bridging the gap between what the community needs and what the donor wants to do, and an organization like us being that in between, you know? And I think we still, even in the 21st century, are really like struggling to find language that can fit both these ends. But having said that, I do know that the landscape is changing, but not changing quick enough. Just to give you a recent example, we've had to sort of adapt our program to an online medium given the pandemic, and we had one of our donors sort of wanting to listen into the program. So she came in, she heard the girls speak, and they're speaking really well in English. They were interacting well, and she asked the question saying, "Do you think that you are at an advantage where against the boys? Are you feeling discriminated?" And the girl said, "Of course not. You know, we have equal opportunities as the boys." So, for one, that question itself is super problematic, because this child really doesn't understand what it means to be discriminated unless you're able to facilitate that conversation with her. But she's taken away saying, "You know what? I think we're working with the wrong group. She really doesn't need it." And how is it that we are able to then talk to her and able to explain to her that, you know, she is not going to talk about being vulnerable, and this age group wants to sound very cool again, right? So how do we understand it and come from the point of the girl to say, she's not going to say sometimes that, you know, she's facing a problem. She's going to say, "I'm powerful, I can do anything I can in the world." How do we have a conversation then to say, well, she has the potential, but unless we bridge these gaps, she's going to be super vulnerable, right? So how do we put that in that context? But having said that, I do notice that there are a lot of organizations now who are donor agencies who are smaller, not like the bigger international donor agencies, but smaller, who are very nimble footed. And and we're very fortunate to work with one such Scottish agency called Scottish Love in Action, who are not donors, they are partners and want to grow with us. And it's a very organic and dynamic way. They've supported 12,000 girls go through voice camps from 2016 to 2019. And even during the pandemic, they've quickly come around to say, "Hey, I know you're not able to do offline camps. Can we do something online? And what are your thoughts?" And they're quickly, you know, supporting 700 girls and 500 boys to go through an online course. So how do we quickly look at being nimble footed and partnering with organizations in the ground to make a difference? Because ultimately, I do think that it, as much as there are well-intentioned donor organizations, there's also very few grassroots organizations that are really there doing the work. So how do we bridge that gap again, right? And just to sort of come to the second point, that yes, money and power definitely go hand in hand, and many times it is the elephant in the room. However, I think if we have one thing to learn from this pandemic and 2020, it is that no matter where we are in the world, we are facing the same thing in very similar ways. So, somebody in Bombay feels similar sort of problems to somebody in Scotland. How do we take that? We are very uniquely placed in history. So how do we look at learning from that? Yes, we are very far away from the community, but how do we put ourselves in that shoe? And maybe the pandemic has a lot to, help us understand in that, right? So, so a quick few things that, donor agencies as well as organizations can sort of like understand is, how do we be nimble footed? How do we quickly look at turning around bureaucratic channels of, how do we turn around to being very fast at prototyping some of the programs that organizations have? And how do we use the power of community to help grassroots organizations learn from each other? I think that again is something that large donor agencies are very well placed to do, and what we require in a global world is the connections. So how can we directly connect with another organization? How can I connect with Buildher and say, "Hey, you know what, you're doing fantastic work. What can I learn from you?" And this platform has enabled me, and hopefully I will get in touch with Tatu to do that sort of learning. But how do we use that power of community to support each other's work? I think that's what I will leave with, and open to questions now.
That's fabulous. That's a really nice thing to leave it with, Anusha. Indeed, I mean, this is a great example of a space where some South-South connections and and learning can take place, and that's brilliant. You know, really good if you guys can do that, and that can be one thing that's come out of today. But thank you for your input. So I'm going to open the floor to questions or comments or anything that you'd like to say. You can type questions into the Q&A box. You can raise your hand. I do have some hands raised, and I have a direct question here, John Ritchie's to Karimi. Karimi, the question is, what is the organisational structure for the 4,200 farmers? You're on. Oh,
sorry,
got it.
I was struggling to unmute there. Thank you very much, John, for the question. So we started with women's groups, savings and loans associations, and have been building that over a couple of years into cooperatives. So there's been quite a bit of training to move from just savings and loans associations to actually a cooperative structure with governance, with systems in place that really enables the farmers both to have a voice as well as an organizational structure that is sustainable over time.
Thank you, Karimi. I have Jo who has raised her hand to speak. Jo, sorry, it's a him or her, I don't know. I've just got Jo.
Yes, Jo Vallis. I'm Jo Vallis. I'm chair of Friends of Chitambo. We're a grassroots. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
A grassroots Scottish registered little organisation, deeply rooted at Chitambo Hospital in central Zambia, where we're involved in health projects. 5 members. We have 11 members of our board now, and 5 are based trustees in Zambia, and the rest are in the UK, including Zambian diaspora members in the UK. So we've been thinking a long time about this issue, and it's wonderful that this shifting the balance of power is coming to pass, because it should have happened a long time ago, I think. But we're not registered in Zambia, and we want to do that. But a difficulty we have, I don't know if anybody can help me with this technical issue, is that we're registered as something called a SCIAF in Scotland, which Scottish Government required us to be in order to apply for grant funding. But it's a peculiar format that's peculiar to Scotland. And in asking our charity regulators, could we do this? We're looking to shift our chairship and our director of operations to the 2 of our Zambian team board members. They said that's fine, but to register a SCIAF in Zambia might be very difficult because it's a Scottish format. So does anybody have any thoughts about that, or experience of trying to do that at all, that you could help us?
If any of the panelists would like to come in on that, please do. But otherwise, I think maybe this is one to take directly to the Alliance, and we can try and deal with that offline in another kind of format. But would anyone like to come in just now on that? No, that's fine. On you go, Karimi, sorry.
Yes, I was going to agree with what Geraldine says, that maybe to take it up bilaterally. I didn't quite understand the form, but if we could get in touch with their colleagues in Zambia as well, and take that forward if the Alliance is not able to do that directly.
Thank you, Karimi, but we will. I think we can make that connection and hopefully take it up directly with the Alliance. Okay, Stephanie, I've got a question from you. I think it's to Tatu. Would you like to ask it yourself? Just unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Thanks.
Great, fab. Thank you to the panel. That was such an interesting, great to hear all of your inputs and thoughts. I guess the question specifically to Tatu, I mean, when you talk there about directly changing the donor status quo, do you think that you were really able to push back against their own agendas and timescales because you didn't come from an international development background? And I'm wondering if kind of having that external experience almost gave you a confidence to challenge the donors, to shift that dynamic to what you saw was really needed on the ground. And it'd be interesting to hear from the other panel members whether they've also experienced that kind of ability to push back and change and challenge the status quo from the donor position. Thanks all.
Thank you so much for the question. I think personally, my background coming from a commercial for-profit environment, I was very clear that if I went to development, I needed to believe in what I was doing. And my prior experience to founding Buildher or co-founding Buildher was I was a country director for an NGO, another NGO working in Kibera, one of the largest informal settlements, creating public spaces for communities within those settlements, so doing urban design, but also architecture design and building it with the communities. And I think what gave me more courage as compared to that commercial to development background was I saw the struggle in trying to build something with people, a physical building, and then handing it over to community to maintain that project in perpetuity. Like as long as it stands, they'll maintain it. Them not having a technical background, them not understanding prioritization of maintenance. And if you don't have that background, then you think you're saving money and then you end up compromising your structure in 2 years because you didn't do a few things. And so I was just very clear that if I did this, I had to do it right because technical skills just need some time. And then when it came to speaking with donors, the reality is we kind of excluded ourselves from some funding by doing that. So it actually did hurt us, but not significantly, because the women who do go from the program, we do see that they're able to increase their income by 3 to 4 times what they made at baseline. And they're growing careers in our sector that has the potential to provide jobs for the next 40 years at the pace we are growing. So we kind of just had to look at the pros and cons and decide what was important. But I think, yes, the courage did come from the background, but it also came from experience of what I'd done before.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tatu. I think we have a question as well from Link Education International. Sam, is that you? Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure, yeah. So it was in relation to what Anusha was saying about bridging gaps and working with communities and strengthening partnerships. So that's really how Link Education works. So there'll be our values and our core strategies is working through communities and partnerships and local government. However, because of COVID, we're really struggling with how to support, particularly in Ethiopia, our 61,000 girls, schoolgirls that we're supporting. We're working through the communities and local government, but this is rural Ethiopia. So there's no digital support, there's no electricity. We can't have socially distanced teaching when there's 61,000 girls to support. So it makes support incredibly difficult. So I wondered if you or anyone else on the panel has any ideas of how to bridge these kinds of gaps.
Can I answer Geraldine? I mean, should I?
Yes, of course. Please do go ahead, Anusha.
Okay. So a couple of things that came, right away to me is that actually we are working in communities where digital access to girls, I'm not only going to say digital access as an overall, the population of girls that we work with will not be given a mobile phone or access to anything like an outside sort of influence because they believe that it's not good for the girl, right? So we've had to face very similar challenges in convincing parents who have phones or mobile phones to be able to spare it for the girl. So one of our, the channels was to say, first, let's identify who has a phone, who has in the family option of a phone, and how do we adapt then our content and our programming to reach out to the girls who have access. Of course, there's a lot of talking to the parents, ensuring that for the few hours the phone is spared to her, and ensuring that we give them enough information to say, okay, this is what we're teaching the girls. So that is one part of it. And the other part of it, where we realize that, it's not that easy to access all girls, obviously, because there is such a digital divide. We have figured out how to reach out to those few girls who have, access to the phone, and give her information and material so she can do the outreach. That has really helped in our favor during the past few months, because, if she has a phone, we are very easily able to send her materials that she can share, posters that she can share, small videos that we've created. So we are now empowering her to do the teaching, but also giving her resources that makes it easy for her to then reach out. So she becomes the peer leader in the community. Definitely, it will not be as effective as you doing the program yourself, but given the circumstances, how do we then look at a resource within the community to help and aid our program? So these are some of the ideas. I'm not sure how it's going to help in the context that you are, but if you have those sort of touch points within the community, how do we activate those touch points to be able to take it further? And just going back a little bit to what Stephanie said about, pushing back on donors, I do think that, it has come to a point where when you do not, push back, you have a mission drift. And given the recent context, like a lot of organizations and funding agencies came to us and said, can you do relief work for COVID? That's not what traditionally Voice for Girls does. But how we were able to push back and say, no, we will not do, anything, because we don't have that expertise. But we do know that during the pandemic, girls have suffered from violence. They don't have access to mental. Can you then reroute it to think of a different way? So I think that sort of an education is important from even the end of the organization that's receiving funding, to say, we cannot do this, but we can do this. And these are the options. And I think there were a few who came back and said, well, that's a great idea. Why don't you do it? So just to sort of bounce back to that question.
Thank you.
Geraldine. Yeah.
Yes, great. Thank you, Anusha. So I'm afraid time has really caught up with us very, very quickly. So I'm just going to ask each of our panelists to sum up, if they can, in 30 seconds or so, what they think a brighter, fairer future would look like from their perspective. We did have another final question there from Moira, which was about complexity and which was about donors focusing on deliverables that might oversimplify things. So if you wanted to touch on an answer to that in your summing up, please do. But I think, Anusha, you were starting to talk about it at the end there when you were talking about mission drift as well, and a little bit about this pushback thing. But I'll invite you all, if you could please, to just sum up. Karimi, shall we go to you first, please?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think for me, the narrative and changing the narrative around voice and how that is expressed, and agency, and what it means to support is quite important. So if I build on, for example, the last question, what was going on in my mind is, have you as linked education probably looked at who else outside the development field is dealing with these issues, is looking at access to digital, the young people in different innovation hubs, for example, providing the technology that actually links into communities where access to the internet is a challenge. So I think the narrative is important, the listening is important, because as we've seen from the examples that Anusha and Tatu have said, it's not that people are sitting back and waiting, but how do we listen as an international community, and how is what colleagues like this and communities like we've heard about, how do we support what they're doing without undermining with our own thinking of what needs to be ticked, what boxes need to be ticked to fill in whatever expectations there are.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Karimi. Tatu, can I come to you to try and sum up briefly?
Yes, I think a fairer world would go in line with the last comment. I can't say the name, Moira, asked about complexity. Because one thing we realized in our work with women's empowerment is people say women aren't in TVET, and they look at our program and they also say, your program is so complicated, you're doing too many things. And we say, well, it's because we are touching on all the things our community have raised is affecting them from participating in this area. And I think a fairer world to me is a world where we are not trying to simplify issues. Africa is not simple. Starting with the butchering up of our countries, it is not a simple place. And I would argue most places in the global south with the complexity of development are not simple. So fairness and equality is listening to things you might think are not relevant and trying to understand why they are to the people you're speaking to, and giving room for that in power dynamics, in financials, in relationships. I think that's critical. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Tatu. Anusha, I'll come to you, please, to try and sum up a brighter, fairer future.
Okay, so just to give context that Scottish Love in Action, the organization that's supporting part of our work, actually, I'd like to bring their example more to say that when, they said we want more data, we said, well, let's do camps and from this generate an impact study that will sort of further help us understand, where to take the organization forward, but also to reinforce what we're doing actually works. And they supported us while supporting programs. So I think that's what the brighter and fairer future looks like, where we're saying that funding has to be collaborative, it has to be organic, and it has to be dynamic. I think that's how we build communities that can rely on data as much as the stories that are happening right there in the ground. And I think these two have to marry and take us forward. So I'll end with that. And thank you so much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much to all of you. I really think there was an awful lot of richness there in a really short time. It could have done with a lot more time, I think, for discussion and for elaboration. But I think the inputs that you gave have been really well received. I mean, just quickly on the chat box, there's lots of people saying that, it's been a really great discussion. So thank you so much to each of you. Thank you for giving us your time and your preparation and your thoughts and your inputs.